For over 1,500 years, the world has been fed a lie about one of history's greatest tragedies. We've been told that Julius Caesar accidentally burned the famous Library of Alexandria during his military campaigns, or that the Muslim or Arab conquerors destroyed it in a fit of so-called religious zealotry. These stories are carefully crafted deceptions designed to hide the real perpetrators of this systematic destruction of Africa's greatest intellectual achievement. The truth is far more disturbing than it might seem to most people. The great or legendary Library of Alexandria, which was actually the crown jewel of African civilization, up the pinnacle of African civilization, was deliberately destroyed, not by accident or so-called foreign conquest, but by the very institutions that have spent centuries promoting alternative narratives of world history. It was more than an intellectual destruction. You might even argue to say that it was a cultural genocide, plain and simple. Before we expose the real destroyers, you need to first understand the magnitude of what was lost in Alexandria. This great library on the African continent wasn't just a collection of books. It was the culmination of thousands of years of African intellectual achievement, located in Kemet, or what they call Egypt, on the African continent. It represented the synthesis of indigenous African wisdom with Greek learning, creating an intellectual powerhouse that had no equal in the ancient world. This wasn't some Greek institution, as most Europeans, I might as well dare say that all European historians love to claim that it was a Greek institution. Alexandria was in Africa, built on the foundation of ancient Kemet, that great civilization that started from the Great Lakes region of Africa. The library housed not only Greek philosophical works, but the accumulated knowledge of ancient Kemet, Nubia, Ethiopia, and other African civilizations that have been lost to time and the lack of memory. Might as well say collective memory. Mathematical treatises that guided pyramid construction, astronomical observations, tackling celestial movements for millennia, observations that had been made by various tribes in the so-called sub-Saharan Africa, like the Dogon. Most of this knowledge, if not all, was systematically eliminated. The African scholars who worked there, including brilliant mathematicians who were part of great African intellectual traditions stretching back to the earliest dynasties of Kemet. they were all eliminated. Africa lost not just books, but the living embodiment of its intellectual heritage. So let's confront the first lie, and that is the story that Julius Caesar destroyed the Library of Alexandria in 48 BCE. Yes, Caesar fought battles in Alexandria's harbor, and yes, some books were stored in warehouses that could possibly have been damaged by fires. But the main library of Alexandria, it most certainly survived and remained intact years after the conquest of Julius Caesar. Roman geographer Strabo, writing decades after Caesar's conquest, describes the library as a thriving institution where scholars actively worked. Indeed, the mathematician Ptolemy produced his groundbreaking works in astronomy in Alexandria around the 2nd century CE. Several hundred years after Caesar's alleged destruction. And most damning of all, the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who also wrote in the 4th century CE, described the Serapeum, which is, for those who are unaware, the daughter library of Alexandria, that it was still containing libraries or books on various topics. So, you can't destroy something that continued operating several years after the conquest of Caesar. So, let's tackle the second lie. The second lie is that of the so-called Arabs or Muslims. Well, the story about Muslim conquerors burning Alexandria and its books is certainly absurd, because it was literally invented 600 years after the supposed events by a writer during the so-called Crusades in the Holy Land. Ibn al-Kifti, writing in the 12th century during intense Christian-Muslim warfare, created this propaganda story to serve a political purpose for the European Christians at the time, who were obviously in conflict with the Arabs and had to paint them black. So here's why the story is actually impossible. The Library of Alexandria had already been completely destroyed by the Christian authorities around 391 CE, nearly 250 years before Muslims even conquered Kemet. The Muslims would have had to destroy a library that no longer existed. They would have had to burn books that had already been burned. A city which was a far cry from its previous glory. The Muslims had no reason to do anything to the city of Alexandria, let alone burn its famous library and books. If Muslims had really destroyed one of the world's greatest libraries, don't you think someone would have written about it at the time? And that's because there's no contemporary source, either Muslim or Christian, that mentions any destruction of a library during the various conquests of the Mohammedans. And as you well know, these Arabs literally extended into Africa proper through Egypt. So who were the real destroyers then? So they've been hiding this truth for more than 1,500 years. The Great Library of Alexandria was systematically destroyed between 391 and 415 CE by Christian authorities who had seized control of the Roman Empire and were actually using their newfound power to eliminate African knowledge and spiritual systems. And for those of you who are unaware, the cult of Isis was also quite predominantly practiced in Alexandria as well around this time. So it wasn't a random religious violence, but more so a calculated attempt to destroy indigenous belief systems and knowledge. I mean, think about it. These were the same people who were calling their own citizens witches and killing them, right? They would call, in Spain, for example, they had the Inquisitions where Christians were killed for worshiping the devil. So it isn't that far-fetched when we say the newly found Christian faith did everything in its power to destroy indigenous belief and knowledge systems, very secrets that were guarded in the Great Library of Alexandria. Indeed, Emperor Theodosius I issued specific decrees ordering the closure of pagan temples in courts and libraries throughout the empire. And in Alexandria, a Christian bishop, Theophilus, took personal charge of implementing the orders of Emperor Theodosius I. So they organized this systematic campaign that did not only destroy the Great Library of Alexandria, but also destroyed its sister or daughter library, the Serapeum, in 391 CE. This is what really happened. So let's look at the contemporary accounts, exactly what happened. So Socrates, Scholasticus, who was don't confuse him with the great Socrates of antiquity, but he was a Christian historian who wrote at the time that the bishop, quote, the bishop Theophilus was demolishing the temples. The Serapeum was a temple which was situated in the most conspicuous part of the city. This temple, then, Theophilus undertook to demolish. They demolished the temple, and the books that were in it were plundered, unquote. So these were the words of Socrates Scholasticus. Again, don't confuse him with the great Socrates of antiquity. Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a Roman historian, also wrote about the destruction of not only the Great Library of Alexandria, but also the Serapeum by these Christian authorities. So Eunapius of Sardis also wrote, quote, "They moved against the temples at Alexandria, and though they had done no wrong, they were destroyed and plundered, and the images of the gods were melted down to make pots and other cheap utensils," unquote. So, for those blindsided Eurocentric Africanists in Europe, they would whitewash this statement, okay? This isn't biased at all. This is the interpretation of eyewitness accounts from people who were actually there. As John Henry Clark would say, those who were not there are now doubting the accounts of those who were there. And we are supposed to go with the racist ideas and interpretations of history of these Eurocentric Africanists. Hell no. So there is this systematic destruction of history and twisting of history. So you would hear about the name Hypatia or Hypatia, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Makes no difference. Hypatia was Alexandria's last great scholar, and they would try and paint Hypatia as being Greek or European, but she wasn't. She was African. Again, a lot of these names were adopted by the conquered peoples, creating the impression as though they were not black. So Hypatia was a brilliant mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. And she actually represented the continuation of Africa's intellectual heritage. She wasn't killed by a random mob. She was murdered by a group of Christian militants or thugs. They dragged her throughout the streets of Alexandria and took her to a Christian church and brutally killed her. They then maimed her and dismembered her body and burned her remains. They subsequently scattered what was left of her. This was ritualistic violence, which was made not to just eliminate the memory of the last great scholar, indigenous African scholar of Alexandria, but to terrorize other African scholars and demonstrates the consequences of maintaining non-Christian intellectual traditions, such as all the secrets in the Great Library of Alexandria, the secrets of the Isis cult, etc. After her death, all other scholars fled Alexandria. And some of these would guard their secrets into various societies in Africa proper. As we've said before, there are a lot of secret societies in the so-called sub-Saharan Africa that trace their origins to Kemet. So, let's look at this systematic intellectual destruction and cultural genocide on African soil. So the destruction of Alexandria wasn't an isolated incident. It was actually part of a systematic pattern that established the templates for European colonial expansion. So the same tactics that they used against Alexandria were later employed. For example, they used that to attack the Mayans. European colonization resulted in the destruction of various indigenous libraries in the Americas, although they wouldn't tell you this. African knowledge systems were suppressed violently during the colonial period. The pattern is always the same. You eliminate the indigenous knowledge systems, destroy their scholars, destroy the infrastructure, and replace local traditions with the conqueror's worldview. So, how have they been able to hide this for 1500 years? Well, the most sophisticated aspect of this cover-up is how it's been maintained across centuries through coordinated institutional effort. The same institutions that destroyed Alexandria, which are Christian churches, European universities, and imperial governments continue to do a similar thing today. These are their strategies. They use four main strategies to protect their reputation. We'll call the first one temporal distancing. And what is this? Well, it happened so long ago. It doesn't matter now. Haven't we heard this before? This completely ignores how the same institutions continue operating today. They create the second method or strategy of false equivalency. Everyone or all societies were violent back then. This strips them of any responsibility. It obscures the systematic and institutional nature of their campaigns to eliminate other cultures. Another strategy is defensive justification. So, quote, Christians were defending themselves against the pagan persecution, unquote. Right? This completely inverts reality. The Christians at this time had imperial power and were the aggressors. They were not merely on the counterattack. And I'll say the last, but not the least, is victim reversal. Those states that Christians were the real victims. This completely flips the historical narrative to make the perpetrators appear as victims. And if you go through these four steps I've just mentioned, temporal distancing, which is a historical relativity, false equivalency, where they make you feel that the aggression is actually justified because everybody else did it, which is also a lie, defensive justification, and finally, victim reversal. These are methods that are still being applied today. The suppression of truth about Alexandria's destruction continues today. And I don't need to tell you, but you can already guess. What are the methods? They have academic gatekeeping. All the European universities systematically exclude any scholars who challenge the dominant narratives about authentic Christian history in Africa. Media manipulation. So that is what these Eurocentric people do. They would create the films, the documentaries, flood the system with false narratives. And if you do not fight back over time, you tend to believe. Digital suppression. So if you go on social media, the algorithms will never work in favor of narratives like this, like what I'm saying. You will get the alternative theories. They will bury any alternative perspective that goes against the status quo. So, understanding the truth about Alexandria's destruction is crucial for recognizing how the same patterns of knowledge suppression continue today. Those very institutions that destroyed Africa's greatest library continue to dominate global knowledge production. They use the same tactics to marginalize African and other non-European perspectives. For us people of African and African descended ancestry, reclaiming this history is part of a broader initiative of intellectual decolonization, stripping our brains bare of Eurocentric narratives, understanding Africa's agency in world history. Please note, Alexandria represented the pinnacle of African intellectual achievement, and its destruction marked a turning point in the global balance of knowledge and power. The time has come for us to reject the lies and reclaim the truth. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed by foreign Christian colonizers who at the time were already in power and were not being subjected to any form of persecution. They made barbaric attempts to wipe out the pinnacle of African intellectual achievement by destroying this great library. They have suppressed this truth for over 1,500 years. But the evidence from written accounts from the time, evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Anytime you hear anyone repeat the false stories about Caesar or some Arab or Mohammedan conqueror destroying Alexandria, just know that Caesar couldn't have destroyed the Great Library of Alexandria because both the Great Library and its sister library were still being talked about. People were still learning in that library over 100 years after Caesar's conquest. And it couldn't have been the Mohammedans either, because they had no reason to destroy any library, because the library was non-existent by the time they got there. Their history is rather recent when it comes to historical narratives. The Muslim conquest is almost like looking back to the 1900s, realistically, compared to the entire history of Kemet. So this has been a cover-up. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed by Christian authorities as part of a systematic campaign to eliminate African knowledge systems and establish a newly found European religion, and to superimpose that religion on Africans, and to wipe out African knowledge. Our ancestors' intellectual achievements were systematically destroyed by foreign colonizers, and the very same institutions continue to suppress the truth today. The truth about Alexandria is that it was a place of great intellectual and cultural achievement of African people. It wasn't a Greek creation. It was an African one. Whatever the Greeks learned in Alexandria, they owe to African people. I'll sign off. Remain black and proud.